Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something that makes modern helicopter parenting look like a vacation. Childhood in ancient China. Forget worrying about screen time limits or college prep. These kids were dealing with arranged marriages before they could tie their shoes, foot binding that would make modern beauty standards seem reasonable, and imperial exams that made the SATs look like a participation trophy. We're talking about an era where bring your daughter to work day meant teaching her how to survive being sold to the highest bidder, and the closest thing to a jungle gym was navigating the actual jungle of not dying before your 5th birthday. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. So you're standing in ancient China, maybe during the Han Dynasty, or perhaps the Tang. You're wondering how to raise a child, maybe provide them with love, education, and a chance at happiness. You're thinking about their future, their dreams, their potential. Nope, that's not how any of this works. If you're in ancient China, childhood in the modern sense doesn't really exist. You don't nurture, encourage, or celebrate individuality. Instead, your child is already categorized as either useful or burdensome, male or female, eldest or expendable. The whole thing is about family honor, imperial service, and economic productivity, not self-esteem or personal fulfillment. If you're wealthy, your son has probably been assigned a tutor who beats him for incorrect brushstrokes before he can properly walk. If you're poor, your daughter might be sold before her 5th birthday. Either way, childhood is less about wonder and more about wondering if you'll survive to see your next birthday. It's not that people in ancient China don't love their children. They do. It's just not the priority. The goal is continuation of the family line, social advancement, and avoiding imperial punishment. Falling in love with your child's personality before they've proven their worth, that's risky. Prioritizing their happiness over family duty, that's scandalous. Either way, it's frowned upon unless you're wealthy enough to indulge in such luxuries. And yet, you dream. Maybe you hope your son will pass the imperial examinations. Maybe you pray your daughter will marry well. Maybe, just maybe, you'll be able to keep them alive long enough to fulfill their predetermined roles. But for now, you wait. You discipline. You prepare them for a world that sees children not as individuals, but as investments in the family's future survival. So you think childbirth is magical. Maybe it's the way a new life enters the world. Maybe it's the hope for the future. Or maybe it's just the relief that everyone survived the process. Your ancient Chinese heart might skip a beat, but steady yourself. Because in this world, birth doesn't guarantee welcome. Before you even think about celebrating, you'd better ask, what gender is this child? And if your answer isn't what the family needs, you might want to sit down. If you're a baby boy, congratulations, you've won the genetic lottery. The family celebrates, red banners hang from the house, and relatives bring gifts. You represent the continuation of the family line, future earning potential, and someone to worship the ancestors when your parents die. Nothing says blessed arrival like being born with the correct set of reproductive organs. If you're a baby girl, well, let's just say the enthusiasm is more measured. Your family needs to calculate whether you're worth the investment. Can they afford your dowry? Will your marriage bring valuable connections? Or are you just another mouth to feed until you join someone else's family? Now let's say you're actually born during a famine, drought, or particularly harsh winter. Suddenly, even being male might not be enough. Your parents look at you, then at their empty grain stores, then back at you. The math is simple and brutal. One more person to feed might mean everyone starves. This is where infant exposure comes in. Not abandonment, mind you. That sounds too harsh. Exposure sounds almost natural, like you're just being introduced to the elements for a bit of fresh air. Unwanted babies, usually girls but sometimes boys during desperate times, were left outside temples, in markets, or simply by the roadside. The hope was that someone else might take them in. A wealthy family might adopt a healthy infant. Buddhist monasteries sometimes collected abandoned children, but more often than not, exposure was just a euphemism for a slower, more socially acceptable form of infanticide. The practice was so common that it barely raised eyebrows. In times of crisis, it was seen as a practical necessity. Better to save the children you can feed than to watch them all die slowly. Cold? Absolutely. Logical within the context. Unfortunately, yes. And if you did survive those crucial first days, congratulations, you've made it past the first hurdle. But don't get too comfortable. Your childhood is just beginning, and it's about to get a lot more complicated. You did it. You survived infancy, which in ancient China was no small feat. Your parents have decided you're worth keeping, and now it's time for the real education to begin. Not reading and writing just yet. We'll get to that particular form of torture later. No, first you need to learn something far more important. Your place in the rigid hierarchy that governs every aspect of Chinese society. Welcome to the world of filial piety, or shao in Chinese. This isn't just about respecting your parents. This is about absolute, unquestioning obedience to your elders, even when they're wrong, especially when you disagree, and always when you'd rather be doing literally anything else. If you're a boy, you're taught that your father is essentially a god in human form. His word is law, his wishes are commands, and his displeasure is the worst thing that can befall you. You learn to bow properly, not just a casual nod, but a full prostration that demonstrates your complete submission. You practice walking 3 steps behind him, never speaking unless spoken to, and certainly never contradicting him in public or private. Your mother, while lower in the hierarchy than your father, still ranks infinitely higher than you. You owe her absolute devotion for the simple fact that she carried you for 9 months and somehow kept you alive this long. Her comfort comes before yours, always. Her needs supersede your wants consistently. And when she's old, you'll take care of her, even if it bankrupts you emotionally and financially. If you're a girl, the hierarchy is even more crushing. You're taught that you have 3 phases of obedience in life. As a child, you obey your father. As a wife, you obey your husband. As a widow, you obey your son. Notice what's missing from that list. Any phase where you get to make your own decisions. This isn't just philosophical, it's drilled into you through daily practice. You learn to serve tea in exactly the right order. Father first, then eldest brother, then other male relatives, then elder women, and finally, if there's anything left, yourself. You memorize the correct forms of address for every possible relative, each one reinforcing your position in the family structure. The Confucian classics, which you'll start memorizing whether you can read or not, are full of stories about children who sacrifice everything for their parents. There's the story of the boy who lay naked on ice to melt it for his stepmother's fish soup. Another child let mosquitoes feed on his body all night so they wouldn't bother his parents. These aren't cautionary tales about going too far, they're examples to follow. Punishment for failing to show proper filial piety could be severe. Physical beatings were not just acceptable, but expected. A father who didn't discipline his child was seen as failing in his moral duty. But this wasn't random violence. It was systematic conditioning designed to break any sense of individual will and replace it with automatic compliance. The scary part? Most children internalized these lessons completely. They didn't grow up resentful of the system. They grew up believing it was the natural order of the universe. They would later impose the same rigid expectations on their own children, perpetuating a cycle of authoritarian control that lasted for millennia. So while Western children might learn to say please and thank you, Chinese children learn to say yes, honored father, and your humble son obeys. Free will wasn't just discouraged. It was seen as a dangerous character flaw that needed to be beaten out of you before it corrupted your moral development. Let's say you're not a peasant child destined for a life of rice farming and manual labor. Let's say your family has enough resources to educate you. Congratulations, you're about to enter one of the most brutal, soul-crushing educational systems ever devised by human civilization. Welcome to traditional Chinese education, where creativity goes to die and memorization is king. Your education begins around age 4 or 5, and it starts with the 1,000-character classic, a poem containing exactly 1,000 different Chinese characters, each used only once. You don't learn what these characters mean, mind you, you just memorize the entire thing by heart. Every character, every stroke, every tone drummed into your brain through endless repetition. Your teacher, probably a failed imperial examination candidate, with a permanent scowl and a bamboo rod, will make you recite the same passages hundreds of times. Get a character wrong? That's a beating. Forget the proper intonation? Another beating. Show even the slightest sign of boredom or creativity? You guessed it, bamboo to the knuckles. The educational philosophy is simple. Children are like empty vessels that need to be filled with classical knowledge. Personal thoughts, questions, or interpretations aren't just unnecessary, they're actively harmful. Your job isn't to understand the material, it's to become a perfect storage device for ancient wisdom. After you've memorized the 1,000-character classic, you move on to the 3-character classic, which condenses the entire foundation of Chinese moral philosophy into 3-character verses. Then comes the Book of Songs, followed by the Analects of Confucius, then the other 4 classics. By the time you're 12, you've memorized roughly 500,000 characters of classical Chinese, most of which you still don't fully understand. But here's where it gets really twisted. The texts you're memorizing were written in classical Chinese, which is about as similar to spoken Chinese as Latin is to modern Italian. So you're not just memorizing difficult concepts, you're memorizing them in what's essentially a dead language that no one actually speaks. Physical punishment isn't just common in Chinese schools, it's considered pedagogically essential. The phrase "spare the rod, spoil the child" could have been invented here, except the Chinese version is more like "spare the rod, spoil the child, disgrace the family, and anger the ancestors." Teachers carry bamboo canes, not as threats, but as teaching tools. Wrong answer? Whack to the palm, sloppy brushwork, whack to the knuckles, daydreaming during recitation, whack to whatever body part is most convenient. Some teachers developed elaborate systems of punishment, different sized rods for different infractions, specific numbers of strikes for specific errors. Students learn to write with a brush, not a pen, and the standards for calligraphy are impossibly high. Each character must be perfectly balanced, with each stroke flowing in exactly the right direction, with precisely the right pressure. Hours upon hours are spent practicing the same characters over and over, striving for an aesthetic perfection that most will never achieve. And here's the cruelest part. After years of this brutal memorization and artistic perfectionism, most students still won't qualify for the imperial examinations. The vast majority will have suffered through this educational torture for nothing more than basic literacy and the ability to quote Confucius at dinner parties. But the system isn't designed to nurture individual talent or creativity. It's designed to produce obedient citizens who revere authority, respect tradition, and never, ever question the established order. In that regard, it's remarkably successful. You know what's funny about modern debates over child labour? We act like it's this shocking aberration, something that only happens in the darkest corners of human society. But in ancient China, child labour wasn't a social problem to be solved. It was just Tuesday. Children started working as soon as they could hold tools without dropping them, which was usually around age 5 or 6. This wasn't part-time summer employment to teach responsibility. This was full-time, essential labour that families depended on for survival. If you're a farmer's child, your day starts before dawn. You're up feeding chickens, carrying water, and helping with the endless list of agricultural tasks that keep a family fed. By age 8, you're expected to tend the family's small plots, pull weeds, and chase birds away from the grain. By 10, you're working the same hours as adults, just with smaller tools and lower expectations. The rice paddies of southern China were particularly brutal for children. Standing knee-deep in muddy water for hours, bent over at impossible angles, pulling weeds and transplanting rice shoots. The work was backbreaking for adults. For children, it was a form of slow-motion torture that permanently bent spines and stunted growth. But agricultural work was paradise compared to what awaited children in craft industries. Silk production, one of China's most lucrative exports, depended heavily on child labour. Children's small fingers were perfect for the delicate work of unreeling silk from cocoons. They spent 12-hour days in hot, humid rooms, their hands constantly submerged in near-boiling water as they carefully unwound the precious threads. The mortality rate among silk workers was high, and not just from accidents. The constant exposure to hot water and steam led to respiratory problems. The repetitive motions caused permanent damage to growing joints. Many children developed a characteristic hunched posture from leaning over the silk vats all day. Mining was even worse. Coal mines, iron ore pits, and salt wells all used children for jobs that adult bodies simply couldn't perform. Need someone to crawl through a narrow tunnel to check for cave-ins? Send a 10-year-old. Need to lower someone into a deep, narrow well shaft? Children weigh less than adults, so they're more cost-effective. In the salt mines of Sichuan, children as young as 7 were lowered hundreds of feet underground in bamboo baskets, often in complete darkness, to work narrow veins that adults couldn't access. The work was dangerous, the air was toxic, and cave-ins were common. But salt was valuable, and small bodies were expendable. The pottery kilns of Jingdezhen, famous for producing the world's finest porcelain, operated on child labour. Children carried heavy loads of clay, tended the furnaces, and performed the dangerous job of reaching into hot kilns to move pieces during firing. Burns were so common, they were considered an occupational hazard rather than an accident. But perhaps the most psychologically damaging work was in domestic service. Wealthy families often purchased children from poor families to serve as household workers. These children, some as young as 5, were completely cut off from their birth families and raised in a form of indentured servitude. They worked from before dawn until after dark, cleaning, cooking, carrying water, and attending to the needs of their owners' children. Children who were often the same age, but lived in completely different worlds. They slept on floors, ate leftover scraps, and were beaten for any perceived infractions. The defense for all this? Children needed to learn the value of hard work. They needed to develop strong character. Besides, idle hands were the devil's workshop, and keeping children busy kept them out of trouble. The reality was simpler and more brutal. Children were cheap labour, and in a society where survival was never guaranteed, their small hands and expendable lives kept the economy running. Their childhood wasn't being stolen. In their society, childhood was a luxury they simply couldn't afford. Let's say you're a girl in ancient China who's just learnt to walk. Congratulations, your parents are already shopping around for a husband. And by shopping around, I mean conducting serious business negotiations that will determine the entire trajectory of your life, none of which involves asking for your opinion. Welcome to the world of child betrothal, where marriage isn't about love, compatibility, or even basic acquaintance. It's about family alliances, economic transactions, and social positioning. You're not a person looking for a life partner. You're a commodity being traded for maximum family advantage. Betrothal often happened before children could even speak in complete sentences. Parents would examine infants and toddlers like they were evaluating livestock, checking for physical defects, family bloodlines, and astrological compatibility. A baby girl with clear skin, bright eyes, and the right birth date might be promised to a family with higher social status or better financial prospects. The negotiation process was elaborate and formal. Matchmakers, usually middle-aged women with encyclopedic knowledge of family genealogies, acted as intermediaries. They carried detailed information about each family's wealth, social connections, and the character traits of the children involved. These weren't casual conversations, they were business deals that could take months to negotiate. The girl's family had to provide a dowry, which often included money, household goods, clothing, and sometimes land. The amount of the dowry reflected the family's wealth and their estimation of their daughter's value. A large dowry might secure a better marriage. A small one might mean settling for a family of lower status or worse character. But here's where it gets particularly disturbing. Once a betrothal was arranged, the girl essentially belonged to her future husband's family. Even though she might still be a toddler, she could be called to live in their household as a child servant, ostensibly to learn their customs and bond with her future in-laws, but actually to provide free labour. These child brides-in-waiting lived in a strange liminal space. They weren't quite family members, but they weren't quite servants either. They were expected to be grateful for their future security while enduring years of unpaid domestic work and constant supervision. They cleaned, cooked, cared for elderly relatives, and generally made themselves useful while waiting to become old enough for the actual marriage ceremony. The psychological impact was devastating. Imagine being 8 years old and knowing that your entire future is already decided. You'll never choose your own spouse, your own career, or even your own daily activities. Your childhood is spent in preparation for a life that someone else has designed for you, with a person you've been told to love, but have no emotional connection to. Education for these girls focused entirely on domestic skills and moral instruction. They learned to embroider, manage household finances, and navigate complex family hierarchies. But they were specifically discouraged from developing any interests or ambitions that might interfere with their primary role as wife and mother. The boys in these arrangements didn't have it much better. While they had more social power in the long term, they also had no choice in their life partners. They might be promised to girls they found physically repulsive or intellectually incompatible, but expressing such preferences was seen as selfish and immature. When the children finally reached an age for marriage, usually somewhere between 14 and 18, the ceremony was more about finalizing a business contract than celebrating a union of hearts. The bride and groom might have grown up in the same household, but still barely knew each other as individuals. The wedding night was often the first time they were alone together, and it was expected to be immediately productive. Pregnancy was the goal, preferably resulting in a male heir as quickly as possible. Romance, if it developed at all, was considered a happy accident rather than the point of marriage. Some couples did grow to love each other over time, finding companionship and affection within the constraints of their arranged marriages. But many others lived as polite strangers, bound together by duty and social expectation, never experiencing anything resembling emotional intimacy. The system wasn't designed to produce happy marriages. It was designed to produce stable family alliances and legitimate heirs. Individual satisfaction was irrelevant. Social order was everything. Warning: this chapter contains descriptions of systematic child abuse that was considered a sign of love and care. Let's say you're a girl from a family with social aspirations. Maybe your parents are wealthy merchants, minor officials, or just successful enough to dream of marrying you into the upper classes. You're around 4 to 6 years old, still playing with simple toys, and thinking childhood will last forever. Then one day, your mother sits you down with an expression of love and determination. She tells you it's time to become beautiful, time to prepare for your future, time for your feet to be bound. Foot binding wasn't just a fashion choice, it was a complex social practice that combined aesthetic ideals, status signaling, and female control into one of the most systematic forms of child abuse ever normalized by a civilization. The process began with soaking your feet in warm water mixed with herbs and animal blood, supposedly to soften the bones and prevent infection. Then came the binding itself. Your 4 smaller toes were broken and folded under the foot, while tight bandages forced your arch to collapse and your heel and toes to grow toward each other. The pain was excruciating. Children would scream for days, unable to walk or sleep. Many developed infections, some of which turned gangrenous. It wasn't uncommon for girls to lose toes or develop lifelong mobility problems. The mortality rate from foot binding complications is unknown, but it wasn't insignificant. But the physical pain was just the beginning. The bandages had to be changed regularly, each time tightening them further to maintain the deformation process. As the bones broke and reset in their new configuration, walking became permanently difficult. Bound feet, called lotus feet, were typically only 3 to 4 inches long in adult women. The practice served multiple social functions, none of which had anything to do with the girl's well-being. Small feet were considered intensely erotic, a secret delight for husbands. The restricted mobility kept women housebound and dependent. The pain and difficulty of walking served as a constant reminder of feminine submission and sacrifice. Mothers who bound their daughters' feet weren't acting out of cruelty. They genuinely believed they were providing their children with the best possible future. A girl with bound feet could marry into a higher social class. She would be considered refined, disciplined, and properly feminine. Her suffering was seen as an investment in her future happiness and security. The economic incentives were real. Families paid higher bride prices for girls with perfectly bound feet. Matchmakers specifically sought out girls whose feet showed the dedication and pain tolerance that bound feet represented. In the marriage market, small feet were literally more valuable than intelligence, kindness, or domestic skills. Girls learned to walk again on their broken feet, developing a characteristic swaying gait that was considered graceful and alluring. They wore special shoes, tiny, elaborately embroidered slippers that showed off the foot's artificially small size. These shoes became status symbols, with wealthy families commissioning dozens of pairs in silk and precious materials. The practice created a strange subculture of female expertise. Mothers, aunts, and grandmothers became skilled in the techniques of foot binding, passing down knowledge about bandaging methods, infection prevention, and pain management. They formed networks of women who supported each other through the process, sharing advice and encouragement. But perhaps the most psychologically damaging aspect was how the practice was framed as love. Mothers told their daughters that enduring this pain proved their devotion to family and their readiness for adult responsibility. The ability to suffer silently became a virtue, and complaining about the pain was seen as selfish and immature. Girls internalized these messages. They learned that their value lay in their willingness to sacrifice their physical comfort for others' aesthetic pleasure. They developed a relationship with pain that normalized suffering as the price of being loved and accepted. The practice continued for over 1,000 years, spreading from the upper classes down through society until it affected women from almost every social background except the very poorest peasants who needed their daughters to work in the fields and couldn't afford to disable them. When foot binding was finally banned in the early 20th century, many women resisted the change. They had suffered to achieve these symbols of status and beauty, and they saw the ban as devaluing their sacrifice. Some continued binding their daughters' feet in secret, unable to imagine a world where female worth wasn't measured in pain endured. Let's say you're a boy from a family ambitious enough to dream of social advancement. Maybe your father is a minor merchant, a village teacher, or just literate enough to recognize opportunity when he sees it. You've shown some talent for memorization and calligraphy, and your family decides to invest in your education with hopes that you might one day pass the imperial examinations. Congratulations, you're about to enter one of the most psychologically brutal academic systems ever devised, where years of preparation culminate in examinations that have a failure rate of over 95%. The imperial examination system was theoretically meritocratic. It promised that any man, regardless of birth, could rise to the highest levels of government through academic achievement. In practice, it was a machine for creating broken scholars and disappointed families. Your preparation begins around age 8 and never really ends. You memorize the entire Confucian canon, hundreds of thousands of characters, covering philosophy, history, poetry, and administrative theory. But memorization is just the foundation. You also need to master the elaborate literary style required for examination essays, learn to write classical poetry with perfect meter and allusion, and develop the calligraphy skills that demonstrate your cultural refinement. The studying consumes your entire childhood. You wake before dawn to practice writing, spend all day memorizing texts, and stay up late into the night reviewing classical commentaries. There's no time for play, friendship, or personal interests. Your family's financial and social future depends on your academic success, and that pressure is constant and overwhelming. Physical conditions in examination halls were deliberately harsh. Candidates were locked in tiny cells, basically wooden boxes just large enough for one person to sit, for anywhere from 24 to 72 hours depending on the level of examination. You brought your own food, water, and bedding. There was a bucket for bodily functions, which you shared with your written materials in the same tiny space. The psychological pressure was intense. Some candidates suffered nervous breakdowns during the examinations. Others became so overwhelmed by the pressure that they wrote incoherent essays, or simply gave up mid-exam. Suicides during examination periods were not uncommon, both in the examination halls and among those who failed. The examination content was deliberately obscure and artificial. Questions might ask you to write a policy memo on governing a province you'd never visited, compose classical poetry on subjects you'd never experienced, or analyze historical situations through rigid Confucian frameworks that bore little relation to practical governance. Success rates were terrifyingly low. In most years, fewer than 5% of candidates passed even the first level of examinations. Higher levels had failure rates approaching 99%. Most candidates took the examinations multiple times over decades, growing older and more desperate with each failure. The social consequences of failure were devastating. Families often bankrupted themselves, supporting a son's examination preparation, selling land, borrowing money, and sacrificing the needs of other children. When the candidate failed, which was statistically almost certain, The entire family suffered economic hardship for nothing. Successful candidates faced their own psychological challenges. The years of obsessive studying often left them socially maladjusted and emotionally stunted. They had missed normal childhood experiences and adolescent development, emerging into adulthood with extensive theoretical knowledge but limited practical skills or emotional intelligence. The system also created a culture of academic obsession that filtered down through society. Even families with no realistic hope of examination success often subjected their children to similar educational regimens, believing that classical learning was inherently valuable and that suffering was necessary for character development. Teachers perpetuated the system's brutality, using physical punishment and psychological pressure to drive students toward ever higher levels of academic achievement. The phrase "iron must be beaten while hot" was commonly applied to children's education, with beatings seen as essential for proper learning. Perhaps most damaging was how the system turned learning into a form of trauma. Children learnt to associate education with pain, pressure, and the constant threat of failure. They developed anxiety disorders, perfectionistic tendencies, and deep-seated fear of making mistakes. Many never recovered their natural curiosity or love of learning. The examination system lasted for over 1,300 years, shaping Chinese attitudes toward education, authority, and personal worth. It created a society that valued conformity over creativity, memorization over understanding, and suffering over joy in the pursuit of knowledge. Even today, echoes of this system persist in educational cultures that prioritize test scores over student well-being, that see childhood as primarily preparation for adult competition, and that measure worth through academic achievement rather than human flourishing. Economic desperation does strange things to parental love. In ancient China, when the choice was between watching all your children starve or selling one to save the others, the mathematics of survival often won over emotional attachment. Child selling wasn't hidden or illegal. It was a recognized social institution with its own customs, contracts, and market prices. Parents didn't abandon their children, they transferred custody in exchange for money that might keep their remaining family alive through another winter. The transactions were surprisingly formal. Contracts specified the price, the child's age and health status, and the expected duties in their new household. These weren't informal arrangements, they were legal documents that transferred ownership of a human being from one family to another. Prices varied based on age, gender, health, and appearance. Healthy boys commanded higher prices because they could perform heavier labor and potentially carry on the purchasing family's line if adopted. Young girls were cheaper, but still valuable for domestic work, and eventually as brides for the family's sons. The peak selling age was between 6 and 10 years old. Children this age were old enough to work, but young enough to adapt to new families and forget their origins. Younger children required too much care. Older ones had already formed strong attachments that made them difficult to control. Famines created periodic surges in the child market. During the great famines that struck China regularly, desperate parents lined up outside wealthy households, offering their children for whatever price they could get. Sometimes they sold children for just enough grain to feed the rest of the family for a few weeks. The children's experiences in their new households varied enormously. Some were treated relatively well, becoming informal family members, who worked but were also fed, clothed, and cared for. Others were treated as disposable labor, worked until they broke, then discarded when they became too sick or old to be useful. Domestic servants had it relatively easy compared to children sold to businesses. Silk workshops, pottery kilns, salt mines, and other industries purchased children specifically for dangerous or difficult work that adult workers wouldn't accept. These children often worked in conditions that would kill adults, justified by the reasoning that their lives had already been paid for. The psychological trauma was severe and long-lasting. Children who were sold experienced profound abandonment trauma, never knowing if their parents had loved them or simply seen them as economic burdens. They lived with the knowledge that they were property, that their lives had literal price tags, and that their value was purely utilitarian. Many never learned their original family names or birthplaces. They grew up with no sense of genetic or cultural identity, creating new identities around their roles as servants or workers. Some were renamed by their new owners, losing even the connection to their birth parents that their original names represented. The practice created complex social hierarchies, even within servant populations. Children who had been sold often looked down on children who had been abandoned, seeing themselves as more valuable because someone had actually paid for them. Meanwhile, children born into servant families were considered lower than those who had been purchased. Some purchased children were raised as future spouses for the family's biological children. These arrangements were considered generous by the purchasing families, who saw them as providing security and family connection for orphaned children. But the children themselves grew up knowing they were essentially being raised as breeding stock. The defense of child selling was always economic necessity and social stability. Advocates argued that selling children to families who could care for them was better than watching them starve. They pointed out that many purchased children ended up in better circumstances than they would have had with their birth families. But the system also created perverse incentives. Some families had children specifically to sell them, treating reproduction as a form of economic production. Others became dependent on child selling as a regular source of income, creating situations where parental love was systematically undermined by financial calculation. The practice persisted for millennia because it served the needs of both buyers and sellers. Wealthy families gained cheap, controllable labor. Poor families gained immediate cash that might make the difference between survival and starvation. The children themselves had no voice in the transaction and no legal protection once it was complete. Even families that didn't sell their children were affected by the practice. Parents used the threat of selling as a form of discipline, and children lived with the constant awareness that their continued presence in the family was conditional on their behavior and economic value. The normalization of child selling shaped broader attitudes toward children's rights, family bonds, and human value. It created a society where children learned early that they were economic units first and individuals second, where parental love was conditional on financial circumstances, and where human relationships could be dissolved through market transactions. Ancient Chinese spirituality was complex and demanding, involving multiple layers of obligations to ancestors, deities, and supernatural forces, and sometimes those supernatural forces had very specific, very disturbing requirements that involved children. Child sacrifice in ancient China wasn't the mass ritual killing you might imagine from other cultures. It was more subtle, more integrated into daily religious practice, and therefore more psychologically damaging for the children who survived it. The practice of burying children alive with deceased rulers was documented in the earliest Chinese dynasties. When a king or important noble died, children minus usually servants or slaves, but sometimes the ruler's own offspring, were buried alive in the tomb to serve the deceased in the afterlife. Archaeological evidence suggests this practice continued well into the historical period, though it became less common over time. But more widespread was the practice of child consecration to temples and religious orders. Families would donate children to Buddhist monasteries or Taoist temples, ostensibly as acts of religious devotion, but often as solutions to economic problems or family planning issues. These children, some as young as 5 or 6, were permanently separated from their families and raised in religious institutions where they had no choice but to take vows of celibacy, poverty, and obedience. They spent their childhoods in meditation, manual labour, and religious study, with no possibility of returning to secular life or starting families of their own. The psychological impact was devastating. Children would be told that their parents had given them to the gods as a special honour, but many understood that they had simply been unwanted burdens. They grew up knowing that their families had found them easier to discard than to raise. Temple life for children was harsh and regimented. They woke before dawn for prayers, spent days copying religious texts or performing menial labour, and were subjected to strict discipline for any infractions. Physical punishment was common, justified as necessary for spiritual development and character building. Many temples used child labour extensively. Young novices tended gardens, cooked meals, cleaned buildings, and performed the physical maintenance that kept religious institutions running. They were unpaid workers whose labour subsidised the temple's operations while being framed as spiritual practice. The practice of ritual self-harm was particularly disturbing when applied to children. Some religious traditions encouraged or required devotees to demonstrate their faith through physical suffering. Children in temples might be expected to fast for extended periods, expose themselves to extreme weather, or engage in repetitive physical practices that caused pain and injury. Ancestral worship created its own forms of child sacrifice, though usually more psychological than physical. Children were taught that they existed primarily to serve deceased family members, that their individual desires were less important than maintaining proper relationships with the dead. The Hungry Ghost Festival was particularly traumatic for children. During this annual event, families believed that the spirits of deceased relatives returned to Earth and needed to be fed and entertained. Children were expected to participate in elaborate rituals that often included elements designed to frighten them into proper reverence for the dead. Some families practiced a form of ritualized child abandonment during religious festivals. Children would be temporarily given to temples or deities, left alone in religious spaces overnight to demonstrate the family's faith and the child's spiritual strength. Many children developed lasting trauma from these experiences of deliberate abandonment. The practice of binding children to religious vows before they were old enough to understand their implications was widespread. Parents would promise their unborn children to religious service or dedicate young children to specific deities in exchange for divine favor. These children grew up knowing that their life paths had been determined by deals made without their consent. Fortune-telling and divination often involved children in disturbing ways. Some religious practitioners claimed they could read the future by examining children's features, behavior, or responses to specific stimuli. Children were subjected to invasive examinations and psychological manipulation, all justified as spiritual insight. The cult of boy mediums was particularly exploitative. Some religious traditions believed that prepubescent boys could channel spirits more effectively than adults. These children were trained in trance states, spirit possession, and ritual performance, often developing dissociative disorders and other psychological problems. Religious festivals sometimes included elements that terrorized children in the name of spiritual education. Elaborate demon dances, graphic depictions of hell, and ritual reenactments of divine punishments were considered appropriate entertainment for young children, designed to instill proper fear of supernatural consequences. The defense of these practices was always framed in terms of spiritual benefit and divine will. Advocates argued that children needed to learn proper reverence for the sacred, that suffering was necessary for spiritual development, and that individual comfort was less important than religious obligation. But the reality was that many religious practices involving children were forms of institutionalized abuse, dressed up in sacred language. Children learned to associate spirituality with fear, pain, and powerlessness, developing relationships with the divine based on terror rather than love or genuine faith. The long-term psychological effects included anxiety disorders, difficulty with authority relationships, and complex trauma responses. Many children who survived extreme religious practices never developed healthy spiritual lives, either rejecting religion entirely or remaining trapped in fear-based belief systems. Ancient Chinese medicine was sophisticated in many ways, with detailed theories about energy flow, herbal remedies, and the interconnection of mind and body. Unfortunately, when it came to treating children, many of these sophisticated theories translated into practices that were terrifying, painful, and often counterproductive. Traditional Chinese medicine viewed children as miniature adults with less developed qi, or life energy. This meant that treatments needed to be more aggressive to overcome their supposedly weaker constitutions. The result was a medical approach that subjected children to intensive, painful procedures that would be considered torture by modern standards. Acupuncture for children involved inserting needles into tiny bodies with the same techniques used for adults. There was no concept of pain management or psychological preparation. Children were simply held down while practitioners inserted needles into dozens of pressure points, sometimes leaving them in place for hours while the child screamed and struggled. The theory was that children's qi flowed more rapidly than adults, so they needed more needle insertions to achieve the same therapeutic effect. Some treatments involved inserting needles into particularly sensitive areas, like the scalp, face, and genitals. Children learned to associate medical care with unavoidable agony. Moxibustion, the practice of burning herbs on the skin to stimulate acupuncture points, was considered especially beneficial for children because their skin was more sensitive and would respond more quickly to treatment. Practitioners would place small piles of burning herbs directly on a child's skin, creating deliberate burns that scarred permanently. These scars were seen as marks of proper medical care rather than evidence of abuse. Parents who could afford regular moxibustion treatments for their children were considered particularly devoted to their offspring's health. The children themselves learned to endure excruciating pain without complaint, knowing that crying or resistance would be seen as character weakness. Herbal medicine for children often involved force-feeding bitter, nauseating concoctions to sick kids who were already miserable. There was no concept of making medicine palatable or age-appropriate. Children were expected to consume adult-strength herbal preparations, regardless of their ability to keep them down. Some herbal treatments were genuinely toxic. Mercury, lead, and arsenic were common ingredients in pediatric remedies, justified by theories about balancing hot and cold energies in the body. Children died from mercury poisoning, while their parents believed they were providing the best possible medical care. The practice of cupping involved creating suction on the skin using heated glass or bamboo cups. For children, this meant having multiple cups attached to their small bodies, creating painful suction that left circular bruises and sometimes permanent scarring. The cups were often left in place for extended periods, while children were forced to remain motionless. Bloodletting was considered essential for treating childhood diseases. Practitioners would make small cuts on children's bodies to release corrupted blood that was supposedly causing illness. There was no understanding of infection control, so these procedures often introduced new diseases rather than curing existing ones. The theory of treating ghost possession in children involved particularly traumatic procedures. Children who exhibited behavioral problems, learning difficulties, or emotional distress were often diagnosed as being possessed by malevolent spirits. Treatment involved exorcism rituals that included physical beating, exposure to loud noises and bright lights, and forced consumption of substances designed to make the spirits uncomfortable. Surgical procedures on children were performed without any form of anesthesia or pain management. Operations to remove tumours, repair injuries, or correct deformities were conducted on fully conscious children who were simply restrained while surgeons worked. The mortality rate from shock and trauma was high, but survivors were expected to be grateful for the medical intervention. Diagnostic procedures often involved invasive examinations that traumatized children unnecessarily. Practitioners believed they could determine a child's health status by examining every part of their body, including intimate areas. These examinations were performed without regard for the child's dignity or emotional comfort. The practice of deliberate scarification for medical purposes left many children permanently disfigured. Certain treatments involved creating patterns of scars on children's bodies, supposedly to redirect energy flow and prevent disease. These scars marked children as having received expensive medical care, but also served as permanent reminders of medical trauma. Traditional bone setting involved manipulating fractured or dislocated bones without pain relief. Children with broken bones were subjected to painful manipulation while being held down by multiple adults. The process often had to be repeated multiple times as bones healed incorrectly, creating cycles of repeated trauma. The psychological impact of these medical practices was severe and long-lasting. Children learned to fear medical practitioners and associate healing with pain. Many developed anxiety disorders around medical care that persisted into adulthood, making them reluctant to seek treatment even when genuinely ill. Parents who subjected their children to these treatments weren't being cruel. They genuinely believed they were providing the best possible medical care. The social pressure to pursue aggressive treatment for sick children was intense, and parents who chose less invasive approaches were often criticized for neglecting their parental duties. The medical establishment actively discouraged questioning of traditional practices. Practitioners who suggested alternative approaches or questioned the necessity of painful procedures were accused of lacking proper training or commitment to authentic Chinese medicine. Death was a constant presence in ancient Chinese households, and children were expected to participate fully in elaborate mourning rituals that could last for years and permanently alter their psychological development. When a parent died, children entered a formal mourning period that dictated every aspect of their lives for the next 3 years. This wasn't simply about grieving, It was about performing grief in socially acceptable ways that demonstrated proper filial piety and respect for the deceased. Children as young as 5 were expected to wear rough, uncomfortable mourning clothes made from coarse hemp that irritated the skin and marked them visually as bereaved. They couldn't wear colours, ornaments, or anything that might suggest happiness or comfort. The physical discomfort was intentional. It demonstrated the depth of their sorrow and their willingness to sacrifice for their deceased parent. The mourning diet was deliberately inadequate and unpalatable. Children were forbidden from eating meat, flavorful vegetables, or anything that might bring pleasure. They subsisted on plain rice, simple vegetables, and water, often losing significant weight during the mourning period. The goal was to make their bodies reflect their spiritual state of deprivation and loss. Crying was not just permitted but required. Children were expected to wail loudly and dramatically during funeral ceremonies and daily remembrance rituals. Professional mourning instructors taught children how to produce the proper sounds and expressions of grief, turning genuine emotion into performed spectacle. Sleep was restricted during mourning periods. Children were expected to sleep on the ground rather than beds, using hard pillows and minimal coverings. The discomfort was seen as appropriate self-punishment for the failure of allowing their parent to die, regardless of the actual circumstances of death. Education and play were suspended during mourning. Children couldn't attend school, play games, or engage in any activities that might bring joy or distraction from their grief. They spent their days in meditation on their loss, reciting prayers for the deceased, and participating in elaborate memorial rituals. The psychological pressure was intense and often counterproductive. Children who showed signs of recovering from their grief too quickly were criticized for insufficient love. Those who seemed to be moving on with their lives were accused of dishonoring their dead parents' memory. Some children developed what we would now recognize as complicated grief disorders, becoming unable to function normally even after the formal mourning period ended. They had learnt to define themselves through their loss, making recovery feel like betrayal of the deceased. The practice of visiting grave sites involved exposing children to disturbing imagery and concepts about death and decay. Children were expected to spend hours at burial sites, contemplating the physical decomposition of their loved ones and their own eventual mortality. Ancestor worship required children to maintain elaborate shrines and perform daily rituals for deceased family members. These weren't simple memorial practices. They were complex ceremonies that required perfect execution and consumed significant time and emotional energy. The economic burden of proper mourning often devastated families. Funeral expenses, mourning clothes, memorial ceremonies, and the loss of productivity during mourning periods created financial hardships that affected children's basic nutrition and educational opportunities. Children learned that expressing genuine emotions was less important than performing socially appropriate emotions. They developed skills in emotional theatre rather than emotional processing, learning to suppress authentic feelings in favour of culturally acceptable displays. The competitive aspect of mourning was particularly damaging. Families competed to demonstrate superior grief through more elaborate ceremonies, more extreme self-deprivation, and more dramatic emotional displays. Children became props in these competitions, with their suffering used to elevate their family's social standing. Some children were selected as primary mourners and subjected to even more extreme requirements. They might be expected to sleep in the same room as the deceased's body, fast for extended periods, or engage in ritualized self-harm as demonstrations of their devotion. The practice of mourning adoptions involved taking children from families who couldn't afford proper funeral ceremonies and having them serve as professional mourners for wealthier families. These children were trained to grieve for strangers, developing complex psychological relationships with death and loss. Recovery from mourning was almost as ritualized as mourning itself. Children couldn't simply return to normal life. They had to be formally released from their mourning obligations through ceremonies that marked their transition back to regular social participation. The long-term psychological effects included difficulty with emotional regulation, anxiety around death and loss, and problems with authentic emotional expression. Many children who experienced traumatic mourning practices struggled with depression and anxiety throughout their lives. Perhaps most damaging was how the mourning system taught children that love should be measured through suffering. They learned that the appropriate response to loss was not healing and moving forward, but prolonged self-punishment and performance of pain. The system also created perverse incentives around death itself. Some children learned to fear loving their parents too much, knowing that deeper love would require more extreme mourning. Others developed complicated wishes for their parents' deaths, seeing mourning as a path to social recognition and adult attention. Ancient China was frequently at war, and this reality shaped childhood in profound and disturbing ways. Military service wasn't just an adult obligation. Preparation for warfare began in early childhood and involved systematic desensitization to violence and death. Boys from military families began weapons training as early as age 6, starting with child-sized swords, bows, and spears. This wasn't playful sparring. It was serious combat preparation that expected children to develop real fighting skills that could be used in actual warfare. The training was physically brutal. Children practiced for hours in all weather conditions, building pain tolerance and physical endurance through progressively more demanding exercises. Failure to meet training standards resulted in physical punishment that was often more severe than the training itself. Child soldiers were not uncommon during periods of intense warfare. Boys as young as 10 might be recruited or conscripted to serve as messengers, servants, or light infantry in military campaigns. They were exposed to the full horror of ancient warfare, seeing friends die violently, participating in sieges where civilians starved, and learning to kill enemy soldiers who might be children themselves. The psychological conditioning was systematic and effective. Children learned to suppress empathy for enemies, to follow orders without question, regardless of their moral implications, and to value military honor above personal survival or family relationships. Training included deliberate exposure to violence and death. Children were required to watch executions, participate in torture sessions as observers, and help dispose of bodies after battles. The goal was to eliminate natural human responses to violence and replace them with professional detachment. Military academies for children combined academic education with intensive combat training. Students learned classical literature in the morning and sword fighting in the afternoon, creating a strange cultural fusion where philosophical study coexisted with preparation for killing. The competitive culture within military training was deliberately harsh. Children were encouraged to fight each other seriously, with injuries seen as valuable learning experiences rather than training accidents. Those who showed mercy or hesitation were subjected to additional punishment and humiliation. Children in military families often witnessed domestic violence that was normalized as part of warrior culture. Fathers who had been brutalized by military service often brutalized their own children, creating cycles of trauma that perpetuated across generations. The practice of using child hostages was common in diplomatic and military negotiations. High-ranking families would exchange children as guarantees of good behavior, knowing that their offspring might be killed if political agreements were violated. These child hostages lived in constant psychological terror, knowing that their lives depended on political decisions they couldn't influence. They grew up in foreign courts or military camps, never knowing if their parents were alive or if they would ever return home. Military service also involved children in logistics and support roles that exposed them to the worst aspects of warfare. They helped manage supply lines that included weapons, provisions, and human trafficking. They witnessed negotiations for slave labor, saw the systematic destruction of civilian populations, and learned to see human suffering as a normal part of military operations. The economic incentives around military service often forced families to send children into dangerous situations. Military pay and opportunities for advancement through conquest made warfare one of the few paths to social mobility for poor families. Children learnt that violence was not just acceptable, but honourable when directed toward appropriate targets. They developed sophisticated justifications for brutality, learning to categorise people as worthy or unworthy of moral consideration based on political and ethnic classifications. The sexual violence that accompanied military campaigns involved children both as victims and as witnesses. Young soldiers were exposed to mass rape, sexual slavery, and other forms of gender-based violence that taught them to see sexual brutality as a normal aspect of conquest. Recovery from military childhood was often impossible. Children who had been trained for violence and exposed to warfare frequently struggled to adapt to peaceful civilian life. They had missed crucial developmental stages and learned skills that were maladaptive in non-military contexts. The hero worship surrounding military achievement meant that children who had survived combat were often celebrated rather than treated for trauma. Their suffering was reframed as character building, and their psychological damage was seen as evidence of their dedication to military virtue. Many former child soldiers became abusive parents themselves, unable to relate to their own children except through the lens of dominance and submission they had learned in military service. They perpetuated cycles of violence, training their own children for warfare, whether or not military service was likely or necessary. The normalization of military childhood also affected children who never served in combat roles. They grew up in a society where violence was seen as natural and necessary, where conflict resolution through force was standard, and where peaceful alternatives to aggression were seen as weakness or naivety. Ancient Chinese spirituality included complex beliefs about supernatural possession, and children were considered particularly vulnerable to spiritual invasion due to their supposedly underdeveloped souls and weaker life force. This led to a systematic approach to childhood behavior management that attributed normal developmental challenges to demonic influence. Children who exhibited what we would now recognize as typical childhood behaviors, tantrums, defiance, mood swings, or learning difficulties, were often diagnosed as being possessed by malevolent spirits. This diagnosis came with treatment protocols that were psychologically and physically traumatic. The identification of possessed children involved spiritual experts who examined children for signs of supernatural influence. These examinations included invasive questioning about dreams, fears, and private thoughts. Children learned that their inner emotional lives were subject to adult scrutiny and supernatural interpretation. Treatment for possession typically began with attempts to make the child's body an uncomfortable place for spirits to inhabit. This involved forced consumption of bitter herbs, exposure to extreme temperatures, loud noises, and bright lights. The goal was to create conditions that would drive out the possessing entities. Exorcism rituals for children were elaborate performances that often lasted for days. Children were restrained while religious practitioners performed ceremonies that included chanting, drumming, incense burning, and ritual objects. The children themselves were expected to participate by confessing their spiritual contamination and begging for purification. Some exorcism practices involved deliberate physical trauma. Children might be beaten with special objects believed to harm spirits, subjected to near drowning in holy water, or forced to endure other painful procedures justified as spiritual cleansing. The psychological impact was severe and long-lasting. Children learned that their natural emotions and behaviors were evidence of spiritual corruption. They developed intense anxiety about their own thoughts and feelings, never knowing when normal childhood responses might be interpreted as demonic influence. The diagnosis of possession also served as a convenient explanation for family dysfunction. Rather than addressing systemic problems like abuse, neglect, or poverty, families could blame children's behavioral problems on supernatural forces beyond anyone's control. Children who were repeatedly diagnosed as possessed often internalized these beliefs, developing dissociative behaviors and multiple personality symptoms that seemed to confirm the original diagnosis. They learnt to split their consciousness as a survival mechanism, creating internal separation between their possessed and normal selves. The social stigma associated with possession affected entire families. Children who had been publicly identified as possessed faced ongoing suspicion and discrimination. They were excluded from social activities, educational opportunities, and eventually marriage prospects. Some children were permanently removed from their families and placed in religious institutions for long-term spiritual treatment. These children grew up believing they were fundamentally contaminated and dangerous to others, developing profound shame and self-loathing that affected their entire life trajectory. The economic exploitation of possessed children was common. Families paid significant fees for spiritual diagnosis and treatment, often bankrupting themselves in pursuit of supernatural cures. Some practitioners deliberately encouraged dependency, requiring ongoing treatments that generated continuous income. The practice of using children as spiritual mediums exposed them to psychological manipulation and abuse. Children who showed signs of spiritual sensitivity were trained to channel spirits, often developing dissociative disorders and losing their sense of individual identity. The belief in child possession also created opportunities for sexual abuse. Some practitioners claimed that physical intimacy was necessary for spiritual cleansing, using religious authority to justify inappropriate contact with vulnerable children. Children learned to suppress authentic emotional expression, knowing that any unusual behavior might trigger possession diagnoses. They developed false personalities designed to avoid spiritual suspicion, losing touch with their genuine thoughts and feelings. The competitive aspect of spiritual diagnosis meant that families sometimes encouraged possession beliefs to gain social attention or sympathy. Children became caught in systems where their suffering was rewarded with increased adult attention and community support. Recovery from possession beliefs was often incomplete. Even children who eventually received more rational explanations for their experiences often retained deep-seated fears about spiritual contamination and supernatural punishment. The long-term psychological effects included anxiety disorders, depression, dissociative symptoms, and difficulty with authentic emotional expression. Many children who experienced possession diagnoses struggled with mental health throughout their lives, never fully recovering from the trauma of being told their essential selves were spiritually corrupted. Perhaps most damaging was how possession beliefs taught children that they couldn't trust their own perceptions and experiences. They learnt that adult authorities had better access to truth about their inner lives than they did themselves, creating lasting problems with self-trust and personal autonomy. The practice of concubinage in ancient China created a system of legalized sexual exploitation that began affecting girls from early childhood. Unlike wives who had some legal protections and social status, concubines were essentially sexual property with no rights and no escape. Girls could be purchased as future concubines while still children, sometimes as young as 8 or 9 years old. These transactions were business deals between families, with no consideration for the girl's preferences or well-being. The purchasing family would raise the child specifically for sexual service, training her in music, poetry, and sexual techniques. The training process was systematic and psychologically damaging. Girls learned that their value lay entirely in their ability to please men sexually and provide entertainment. They were taught to suppress their own desires and preferences, developing personalities designed to appeal to male fantasies rather than express authentic selves. Physical preparation for concubinage often involved procedures designed to enhance sexual appeal. Beyond foot binding, girls might undergo treatments to lighten their skin, shape their bodies, or modify their voices. These procedures were painful and sometimes dangerous, but were considered necessary investments in the girl's future value. Concubines in training lived in a strange liminal space where they were neither children nor adults, neither family members nor servants. They had more privileges than regular servants, but fewer rights than daughters. They learned to navigate complex social hierarchies, while knowing their ultimate destiny was sexual servitude. The psychological conditioning was sophisticated and effective. Girls learned to find validation through male approval, to compete with other women for sexual attention, and to see their worth entirely through their ability to provide pleasure to men. Sexual education for future concubines began early and was explicit. Girls were taught specific techniques and practices through instruction that would be considered sexual abuse by modern standards. They learned to dissociate from their own physical experiences, treating their bodies as tools for others' pleasure. The economics of concubinage created perverse incentives for families. Poor families could improve their financial situation by selling attractive daughters into concubinage. The immediate payment might solve pressing economic problems, while the ongoing support of a well-placed concubine could provide long-term family benefits. Competition among concubines was deliberately encouraged. Women were taught to see each other as rivals rather than allies, creating systems of surveillance and sabotage that prevented solidarity and mutual support. This competitive environment made it impossible for concubines to organize resistance or support each other effectively. The legal status of concubines was precarious and completely dependent on male protection. They could be sold, traded, or discarded at any time without legal recourse. Children born to concubines had limited rights and no inheritance claims, creating additional incentives for emotional detachment. The practice of temporary concubinage allowed men to purchase sexual services for specific periods without long-term commitment. These arrangements treated women as rental property, creating systems where human beings were leased for sexual use and then returned when no longer wanted. Child concubines were particularly vulnerable to abuse and exploitation. They had no legal protections, no family support, and no social advocates. Their suffering was invisible to official record-keeping and historical documentation, making the full extent of their abuse difficult to document. The psychological damage from concubinage was severe and typically irreversible. Women learned to split their consciousness, developing false personalities for public performance while suppressing their authentic selves. Many developed what we would now recognize as complex trauma disorders. The social normalization of concubinage affected all women, not just those directly involved. All girls grew up knowing that sexual exploitation was a possible fate, creating anxiety and compliance behaviors designed to avoid being selected for sexual service. The practice also corrupted family relationships, as fathers, brothers, and sons participated in systems of female exploitation. Women couldn't trust male family members to protect them from sexual commodification, knowing that economic pressures might lead to their sale regardless of family affection. Recovery from concubinage was nearly impossible. Women who escaped or were released from sexual service found themselves unmarriageable and unemployable. They had been trained for sexual service rather than practical skills, leaving them economically dependent on continued sexual exploitation. The children of concubines inherited their mother's marginalized status, creating generational cycles of exploitation and social exclusion. They grew up knowing that their mothers were sexual property, affecting their own relationships with sexuality, intimacy, and personal worth. The concubinage system lasted for millennia because it served the sexual and economic interests of powerful men while providing a convenient solution for families with too many daughters and insufficient resources. The women and girls caught in this system had no political voice and no legal recourse, making systematic reform impossible until much later historical periods. Ancient China faced regular natural disasters, floods, droughts, earthquakes, and famines that could devastate entire regions and last for years. During these crises, the thin veneer of social protection for children disappeared entirely, revealing just how expendable young lives were considered when survival was at stake. The great famines that struck China periodically created conditions where normal moral standards simply evaporated. Parents faced impossible choices: watch all their children starve slowly, or sacrifice some to save others. The mathematics of survival overrode emotional bonds with predictable and horrifying regularity. During famine periods, child abandonment became so common that it barely registered as unusual. Weakened parents would leave infants by roadsides or temple steps, hoping someone with more resources might take them in. Most of these children died within days, but abandonment allowed parents to maintain the fiction that their children might survive while preserving resources for those they kept. The practice of eating grass, bark, and other non-food items during famines often poisoned children who were too young to understand what was safe to consume. Parents desperate to feed their families would mix anything remotely edible into thin gruel, sometimes accidentally poisoning their children in attempts to keep them alive. Child trafficking increased dramatically during disaster periods. Desperate parents sold children to anyone willing to pay, often without investigating what kind of life awaited their offspring. Some children were sold into sexual slavery, others into dangerous labor, still others to families who practiced ritual sacrifice or other extreme religious practices. The breakdown of social order during disasters meant that children lost all legal protections. Warlords, bandits, and displaced populations could abuse, kidnap, or kill children with no consequences. Many children were pressed into military service by armed groups who needed small bodies for espionage, message carrying, or suicide attacks. Earthquake survivors often lived in temporary camps where normal family structures collapsed. Children were separated from parents during evacuation, creating populations of orphaned children with no formal support systems. These children survived through begging, theft, and often prostitution, aging rapidly as they learnt to navigate a world without adult protection. Flood disasters created particular horrors for children. Families fleeing rising waters often had to choose which children to carry and which to leave behind. The smallest and weakest were typically abandoned first, creating scenarios where parents deliberately allowed some children to drown in order to save others. Disease outbreaks that accompanied natural disasters disproportionately affected children whose immune systems couldn't cope with contaminated water, inadequate nutrition, and overcrowded living conditions. Entire populations of children would die from preventable diseases, while adults focused on basic survival. The practice of infanticide during disasters was often formalized through community decision-making. Villages would collectively decide that newborns and very young children should be killed to preserve resources for older children and adults who had better survival chances. Cannibalism during extreme famines sometimes involved children both as victims and as unwilling participants. Historical records document cases where parents fed deceased children to surviving family members, and where children were killed specifically to provide food for adults deemed more valuable for family survival. The psychological trauma for children who survived disasters was severe and long-lasting. They had witnessed the death of siblings, participated in their family's moral collapse, and learned that parental love was conditional on resource availability. Many never recovered their ability to trust or form healthy attachments. Child labour during disaster recovery often involved dangerous work that adults couldn't or wouldn't perform. Children were sent into collapsed buildings to search for survivors, required to work in contaminated areas, and used for tasks that exposed them to ongoing risks of injury or death. The economic disruption caused by disasters often forced families to make permanent changes in their treatment of children. Families that had previously educated their children might be forced to use them for manual labour. Those that had protected daughters from early marriage might sell them to recover from economic losses. Religious interpretations of disasters often blamed children for divine punishment. Communities might decide that specific children had angered the gods and needed to be sacrificed or expelled to prevent further catastrophe. Scapegoating of children during crises served to redirect community anger and maintain adult solidarity. The breakdown of educational systems during disasters meant that entire generations grew up without formal learning. Children who survived disasters often remained illiterate and innumerate, permanently disadvantaged in their ability to improve their circumstances or protect their own children from similar fates. Recovery from disasters rarely prioritized children's needs. Reconstruction efforts focused on economic productivity and political stability, with children's welfare considered only after adult concerns were addressed. Many disaster-affected children never received the support necessary to process their trauma or rebuild their lives. The normalization of extreme measures during disasters created lasting changes in social attitudes toward children. Communities that had practiced infanticide, child abandonment, or child trafficking during crises often continued these practices even after conditions improved, having learned to see children as expendable resources rather than individuals deserving protection. Ancient Chinese society was rigidly stratified, and children learned their place in the social hierarchy before they could properly walk. Your worth as a human being was determined not by your character, intelligence, or potential, but by the circumstances of your birth. Circumstances you had no control over and could rarely change. If you were born into the nobility, your childhood was a careful cultivation of superiority and entitlement. You learned that common people existed to serve you, that your comfort was more important than their suffering, and that your bloodline made you inherently better than the vast majority of humanity. Noble children were raised by servants and tutors, rather than their parents, developing emotional relationships with people who could be dismissed or punished at will. They learnt to see human relationships as transactions based on power, rather than affection, creating patterns of emotional detachment that lasted throughout their lives. The education of noble children emphasized their right to rule over others. They studied military strategy, administrative theory, and classical literature, but they also learned practical skills in domination, how to inspire fear, command obedience, and maintain social control over large populations. Merchant families occupied a strange middle position in the social hierarchy. They might have significant wealth, but they lacked the hereditary status that granted true social acceptance. Their children grew up with resources, but without security, knowing that their family's position depended on continued business success. Merchant children often experience profound anxiety about their social status. They had access to luxury and education, but they also knew that they were looked down upon by families with less money but better bloodlines. They learned to compensate for social insecurity through conspicuous consumption and aggressive social climbing. The pressure on merchant children to succeed academically was intense. The imperial examination system offered one of the few paths to legitimate social advancement, but the competition was fierce, and the failure rate was crushing. Many merchant families bankrupted themselves, trying to purchase their children's advancement through education. Artisan families passed specialized skills from generation to generation, but they also passed along the knowledge that their children would likely spend their entire lives performing the same repetitive tasks as their parents. There was little hope for advancement and significant risk of economic displacement. Artisan children began learning their trades as soon as they could hold tools. Childhood was viewed as preparation time for adult labor, not as a period for play, exploration, or personal development. Many developed repetitive stress injuries and occupational health problems before reaching adulthood. The competitive nature of artisan work meant that families often guarded trade secrets jealously, even from their own children, until they were old enough to be trusted with economically valuable information. Children grew up in households where knowledge was power, and sharing information outside the family could lead to economic ruin. Peasant children had the hardest lives and the fewest opportunities for advancement. They were born into agricultural labor and could expect to spend their entire lives farming the same plots of land their ancestors had worked for generations. Education for peasant children was minimal and focused entirely on practical skills. They learnt to read and write only if literacy was necessary for their work, and their mathematical education was limited to the calculations needed for agricultural planning and tax payments. The physical demands of agricultural work meant that peasant children developed adult work responsibilities while their bodies were still growing. They suffered from malnutrition, overwork, and occupational injuries that affected their physical development and long-term health. Slave children represented the bottom of the social hierarchy. They were born into bondage and had no hope of freedom or advancement. Their childhood was spent learning to serve others and accept abuse without resistance or complaint. The psychological conditioning of slave children was systematic and effective. They learned that their lives had no value beyond their usefulness to their owners, that resistance was futile, and that their suffering was natural and inevitable. Slave children were often deliberately separated from their parents to prevent the formation of family bonds that might interfere with their complete submission to their owners. They were raised by other slaves or servants who taught them the skills necessary for servitude, while discouraging any sense of personal identity or individual worth. The rare opportunities for social mobility through military service, religious advancement, or exceptional talent came with their own forms of childhood trauma. Children who showed promise for advancement were often removed from their families and subjected to intensive training regimens that prioritized achievement over emotional well-being. The imperial examination system theoretically offered merit-based advancement, but in practice, it was dominated by families wealthy enough to provide years of expensive education. Poor children who showed academic talent might be sponsored by wealthy patrons, but this sponsorship came with obligations that essentially transferred ownership of the child from their birth family to their benefactors. Children who attempted to cross class boundaries faced enormous psychological pressure. They had to abandon the cultural patterns of their birth families while never being fully accepted by the social classes they aspired to join. Many developed identity disorders and never felt comfortable in any social setting. The enforcement of class boundaries was often violent and public. Children who showed inappropriate ambition or failed to demonstrate proper deference to their social superiors faced beatings, public humiliation, and permanent marking that identified them as troublemakers. Perhaps most damaging was how the class system taught children that human worth was inherent and unchangeable. They learned that some people deserved comfort while others deserved suffering, that inequality was natural and divinely ordained, and that challenging social hierarchy was both futile and morally wrong, the legal system in ancient China operated on principles that would be shocking to modern sensibilities, particularly in its treatment of children. Children had no independent legal status and were considered property of their families, with no rights, protections, or recourse when faced with abuse or exploitation. The concept of children's rights simply didn't exist. Children couldn't own property, enter contracts, or make legal decisions about their own lives. They were completely subject to parental authority, which was essentially unlimited and legally protected. Parents could sell their children, beat them, or even kill them with minimal legal consequences. The practice of collective punishment meant that children could be held legally responsible for crimes committed by their relatives. If a father committed treason, his children might be executed, enslaved, or permanently marked as traitors, regardless of their age or involvement in the original crime. Children could be legally married off without their consent from very young ages. These marriages were binding contracts that transferred ownership of the child from parents to spouse, with no consideration for the child's preferences or emotional readiness for marriage. The legal system recognized different categories of children based on their social status, legitimacy, and gender. Legitimate sons had more legal protections than daughters, who had more protections than illegitimate children, who had more protections than slave children. This hierarchy meant that justice depended entirely on accident of birth. Child testimony was considered legally worthless in most circumstances. Children couldn't testify against adults, particularly against their own parents or family members. This meant that child abuse was essentially unprosecutable, since the only witnesses were legally prohibited from speaking about their experiences. The punishment system for children was harsh and often disproportionate. Children could be beaten, branded, or permanently disfigured for relatively minor infractions. The goal wasn't rehabilitation or education, it was deterrence through fear and demonstration of absolute adult authority. Physical punishment of children was not just legal, but mandated by law in many circumstances. Parents who failed to discipline their children appropriately could face legal consequences themselves. The state actively encouraged child abuse through legal frameworks that required harsh physical punishment. The practice of legal adoption was primarily about property transfer rather than child welfare. Children could be adopted to provide labour, inheritance claims, or social advancement for the adopting family. The child's well-being was rarely considered in these transactions. Children born into slavery had no legal existence as individuals. They were property that could be bought, sold, traded, or disposed of like any other commodity. Their suffering had no legal significance, and killing a slave child was treated as destruction of property rather than murder. The legal system provided elaborate protections for family honour and parental authority, while offering no protections for children's physical safety or emotional well-being. A parent who killed their child to preserve family honour faced lighter legal consequences than a child who dishonoured their parents through disobedience. Legal contracts could obligate children to specific futures without their consent. Parents could sign binding agreements that committed their children to military service, religious orders, or specific marriages. These contracts were enforceable regardless of the child's later preferences or circumstances. The inheritance system discriminated heavily against children based on gender and birth order. Daughters typically inherited nothing, while younger sons received minimal shares. This legal framework incentivized families to value children differently, based on their inheritance potential rather than their individual worth. Criminal children faced adult punishments in a legal system that made no accommodations for their age or developmental status. A 10-year-old thief faced the same potential punishments as an adult thief, including death, mutilation, or permanent enslavement. The legal concept of parental responsibility was entirely one-sided. While parents had unlimited authority over their children, they faced minimal legal consequences for abuse, neglect, or exploitation. Children, meanwhile, could face severe punishment for any perceived disrespect or disobedience toward their parents. Legal marriage ages were shockingly young by modern standards, with girls legally marriageable as young as 12 or 13. These weren't just theoretical ages, they were actively enforced through legal frameworks that encouraged early marriage as a form of economic and social stability. The legal system's treatment of orphaned children was particularly harsh. Without family protection, orphans had no legal advocates and could be exploited, abused, or killed with minimal consequences. They often fell into legal grey areas where no one had responsibility for their welfare. Perhaps most disturbing was how the legal system actively discouraged legal reform that might protect children. The framework was designed to preserve traditional authority structures, making it legally dangerous to advocate for children's rights or challenge established patterns of child treatment. Even childhood entertainment in ancient China was designed to prepare children for the harsh realities of adult life, often involving elements that would be considered psychologically damaging by modern standards. Play wasn't seen as a natural expression of childhood joy, but as another opportunity for moral instruction and social conditioning. Traditional children's games often involved themes of death, violence, and social hierarchy. Children played elaborate games that simulated warfare, execution, and social punishment. These weren't just innocent fun, they were systematic preparation for a world where violence was normal and authority was absolute. The game of judge and criminal was popular among children, involving elaborate role-playing of court proceedings that ended in punishments like mock executions, beatings, and humiliation. Children learned to find entertainment in the suffering of others, and to see judicial violence as normal and even enjoyable. Military-themed play was encouraged for boys from very young ages. They played with real weapons scaled down to child size, practiced combat formations, and engaged in competitive fighting that often resulted in serious injuries. The goal was to eliminate natural human reluctance to hurt others and replace it with aggressive competitiveness. Girls' games focused on preparing them for domestic submission and sexual service. They played house with elaborate scenarios involving multiple wives, concubines, and servants, learning to navigate complex hierarchies of female subservience. These games normalized polygamy, sexual competition, and female powerlessness. The practice of foot racing for girls with bound feet was a particularly cruel form of entertainment. Girls were encouraged to compete in activities that caused them intense pain, while adults found amusement in their suffering. This taught children that their pain could be a source of others' pleasure. Gambling was introduced to children at young ages through games that involved real money and serious consequences. Children learnt to risk resources they couldn't afford to lose, developing gambling addictions, and learning that luck was more important than effort or moral behaviour. Animal cruelty was normalised through children's entertainment. Popular games involved torturing insects, birds, and small animals for amusement. Children learnt to find pleasure in causing suffering to creatures more vulnerable than themselves, developing empathy deficits that lasted into adulthood. Competitive storytelling games required children to memorise and recite increasingly violent and disturbing tales. They competed to tell the most graphic stories of murder, torture, and supernatural punishment, becoming desensitized to violence through repeated exposure to disturbing imagery. The practice of beggar play involved children dressing as outcasts and performing elaborate scenarios of poverty, disease, and social rejection. This entertainment taught children to find amusement in others' misfortune while reinforcing social hierarchies that justified inequality. Religious festivals often included entertainment designed to terrify children. Elaborate demon dances, graphic depictions of hell, and ritual reenactments of divine punishment were considered appropriate family entertainment. Children learned to associate spirituality with fear and to see terror as a normal part of religious experience. The game of merchant and slave involved children buying and selling each other in mock transactions that mimicked real slave markets. These games normalized human trafficking and taught children to see other people as commodities that could be owned and traded. Competitive academic games involved public humiliation for children who failed to demonstrate adequate knowledge. These weren't gentle educational activities. They were high-stakes competitions where failure resulted in physical punishment and social shame. The practice of execution play involved children role-playing elaborate death scenarios, taking turns being executioners and victims. They learned detailed knowledge about torture methods and execution techniques, becoming familiar with violence as a form of social control. Music and performance training for children often involved themes of suffering and submission. Girls learned songs about tragic heroines who died for love or duty, while boys learned martial songs that glorified violence and conquest. Entertainment became a vehicle for transmitting cultural values that prioritized duty over happiness. Seasonal festivals included children's activities that celebrated violence and social control. During certain holidays, children participated in mock battles, ritual punishments, and ceremonies that reinforced traditional power structures while providing community entertainment. The competitive nature of most children's entertainment eliminated the possibility of pure play. Everything became a contest with winners and losers, teaching children that life was a zero-sum game where others' success required their own failure. Perhaps most damaging was how children's entertainment eliminated the boundary between play and reality. Games that simulated adult responsibilities and traumas prevented children from developing the psychological separation between childhood and adulthood that allows for healthy emotional development. The systematic use of entertainment to transmit cultural values meant that children's natural playfulness was co-opted by adult agendas. They never experienced pure, unstructured play that might have allowed them to develop independent creativity or emotional processing skills. The understanding of disease and hygiene in ancient China was based on philosophical theories rather than scientific knowledge, leading to practices that not only failed to protect children's health, but often actively damaged it. Children suffered and died from preventable diseases, while being subjected to treatments that made their conditions worse. The theory of miasma suggested that diseases came from bad air and moral corruption rather than specific pathogens. This meant that sick children were often blamed for their own illnesses, accused of having weak character or insufficient moral development that made them vulnerable to disease. Bathing was considered potentially dangerous for children, as it was believed to weaken their natural defenses and make them more susceptible to illness. Children might go months without proper washing, developing skin infections and parasitic infestations that were then treated as separate diseases rather than consequences of poor hygiene. The practice of using human waste as fertilizer meant that children played in environments contaminated with fecal matter. They developed chronic intestinal parasites and waterborne diseases that stunted their growth and cognitive development. These health problems were often attributed to spiritual causes rather than environmental contamination. Traditional Chinese medicine's emphasis on hot and cold foods led to dietary restrictions that malnourished sick children. During fevers, children might be denied water or cooling foods that could have helped their recovery. During digestive illnesses, they might be given spicy or difficult to digest foods that worsened their conditions. The practice of treating childhood diseases with adult medications led to frequent poisoning and overdoses. There was no understanding of dosage adjustment for smaller bodies, so children received the same concentrations of herbs and minerals that were prescribed for adults, often with toxic results. Smallpox inoculation, when it was practiced, involved deliberately infecting children with live smallpox virus through nasal insertion of infected material. While this sometimes provided immunity, it also killed many children outright or left them permanently disfigured. The practice was defended as necessary despite its obvious dangers. Quarantine practices for diseased children often involved complete isolation from family members, including parents. Sick children were left alone for days or weeks, receiving minimal care while struggling with serious illnesses. Many died from dehydration and neglect, rather than their original diseases. The belief that strong odours could prevent disease led to practices that filled children's living spaces with smoke, incense, and other irritants. Children with respiratory problems were exposed to additional lung irritants in the name of disease prevention, worsening their breathing difficulties. Traditional treatments for childhood fevers included wrapping sick children in multiple layers of clothing and blankets to sweat out the illness. This practice often led to dangerous overheating and dehydration, turning manageable fevers into life-threatening medical emergencies. The practice of bloodletting for sick children involved making cuts on their small bodies to release corrupted blood. Children who were already weakened by illness lost additional blood through medical procedures, often dying from the treatment rather than their original conditions. Herbal treatments for children often involved force-feeding bitter, nauseating substances to kids who were already struggling to keep food down. The vomiting and diarrhea caused by these treatments were interpreted as signs that the medicine was working, leading to continued administration of harmful substances. The belief in supernatural causes of disease meant that children's medical care often included exorcism rituals, spiritual cleansing ceremonies, and other practices that delayed or prevented actual medical treatment. Children died from treatable conditions, while their families pursued supernatural cures. Dental hygiene for children was virtually non-existent. Children developed painful tooth decay and gum disease that affected their ability to eat and their overall health. Dental problems were often attributed to moral failings rather than lack of oral hygiene. The practice of using children as test subjects for new medical treatments exposed them to experimental procedures with unknown risks. Children were given untested herbal combinations, subjected to new surgical techniques, and used as subjects for medical experimentation without informed consent. Epidemic diseases spread rapidly through communities because of poor understanding of contagion. Children were not protected from exposure to diseases like cholera, typhoid, and bubonic plague. They continued to attend school and social gatherings even during outbreaks, spreading disease throughout their communities. The treatment of mental illness in children involved practices that would be considered torture by modern standards. Children with developmental disabilities, behavioral problems, or emotional distress were subjected to beatings, restraints, and other harsh treatments designed to correct their conditions. Perhaps most tragic was how medical ignorance led to preventable deaths being accepted as normal. Families expected to lose multiple children to disease and developed emotional coping mechanisms that involved psychological detachment from their children's suffering. The combination of poor hygiene, inadequate medical knowledge, and harmful treatments meant that childhood in ancient China was a gauntlet of disease and medical trauma that most children were expected to navigate without adequate protection or care. Ancient China was vast and culturally diverse, and the specific forms of childhood trauma varied significantly depending on where and when a child was born. Geography wasn't just about climate and landscape. It determined which particular forms of suffering would define a child's early years. In the northern regions, where winters were harsh and resources scarce, child abandonment during cold months was accepted as a necessary survival strategy. Families would calculate which children could be kept alive through winter and abandon the rest before the worst weather hit. The practice was so common that communities developed informal adoption networks for winter-abandoned children. Southern China's wet climate and rice-based agriculture created different challenges for children. The constant work in flooded rice paddies exposed children to waterborne diseases and parasites. Many children developed chronic health problems from prolonged exposure to contaminated water, while others drowned in irrigation systems they were too small to navigate safely. Mountain communities practiced forms of child exposure, unique to their geography. Unwanted infants were left on mountainsides during winter, ostensibly for the gods to claim, but actually to die from exposure. The high altitude and extreme weather made these deaths both quick and certain. Coastal regions had their own distinctive forms of childhood trauma. Children were regularly pressed into dangerous maritime labour, working on fishing boats and trading vessels where drowning was a constant risk. Piracy was common in coastal areas, and children were often kidnapped and forced into naval slavery. The practice of child sacrifice varied significantly by region, with some areas maintaining ancient traditions long after they had been abandoned elsewhere. Certain mountain communities continued burying children alive with deceased elders well into the historical period, while river communities practiced ritual drowning of children during flood seasons. Border regions faced unique challenges related to warfare and cultural conflict. Children in these areas were regularly exposed to military violence, forced displacement, and cultural suppression. They lived in a constant state of uncertainty, never knowing when their communities might be attacked or their families scattered. Desert regions practiced extreme forms of resource conservation that disproportionately affected children. During droughts, children received reduced food and water rations first, and were often the first to be abandoned when resources became critically scarce. Urban areas created their own forms of childhood trauma through overcrowding and pollution. Children in cities faced higher disease rates, exposure to toxic industrial processes, and social problems like organised crime and prostitution that were less common in rural areas. Religious centres developed distinctive practices around child dedication and service. Some monastery towns required families to contribute children for religious service, creating communities where child removal was systematized and culturally mandated. Trade route communities exposed children to unique dangers related to commerce and travel. Children were often kidnapped and sold into slavery in distant regions, trafficked along trade routes as valuable commodities, or used as translators and guides in dangerous territory. Mining regions subjected children to particular forms of industrial trauma. Coal mining areas used children extensively for underground work, while salt mining regions lowered children into deep, narrow shafts where adult bodies couldn't fit. The health consequences were severe and often fatal. Agricultural regions specialized in different forms of child labor, depending on their primary crops. Tea-growing areas used children for delicate picking work that required small fingers and nimble movement. Silk-producing regions employed children in cocoon processing that damaged their hands and respiratory systems. Frontier settlements often practiced informal child adoption systems, where children were traded between families based on labor needs rather than emotional connections. Children grew up knowing they might be transferred to different families if economic circumstances changed. Some regions developed cultural practices that were particularly harmful to specific genders. Certain areas practiced more extreme forms of female infanticide, while others had traditions of sending boys into dangerous military service at younger ages than the national standard. The interaction between local customs and imperial law created additional complications for children. Some regions maintained traditional practices that conflicted with official policy, putting children at risk of punishment for following local customs that violated imperial regulations. Climate disasters affected different regions in distinctive ways, creating region-specific forms of childhood trauma. Areas prone to flooding developed cultural practices around temporary child abandonment during high water seasons. Drought-prone regions normalized extreme food restrictions for children during dry periods. Perhaps most significantly, the availability of escape routes and alternative opportunities varied dramatically by region. Children in some areas had possibilities for social mobility or geographic relocation that were completely unavailable to children in more isolated or politically restricted regions. The regional variation in childhood experiences meant that ancient China wasn't a single system of child rearing, but rather a collection of different cultural approaches to childhood that shared common themes of adult authority, economic utility, and social control, while expressing these themes through locally specific practices. So there you have it, 20 chapters of what it was really like to be a child in ancient China, and frankly, we've barely scratched the surface. We could talk about the practice of child espionage, where children were trained as spies and assassins. We could explore the systematic use of children in religious ceremonies that required human blood. We could delve deeper into the regional variations in child trafficking, or the specific techniques used to break children's spirits in various industries. But I think you get the picture. Childhood in ancient China wasn't a time of wonder, discovery, and protected innocence. It was a brutal apprenticeship in survival, submission, and social hierarchy that prepared children for an adult world that valued conformity over creativity, duty over happiness, and social stability over individual fulfillment. These weren't isolated incidents of child abuse by particularly cruel individuals. These were systematic, culturally endorsed practices that were seen as normal, necessary, and even beneficial for children's development. The adults who implemented these practices genuinely believed they were acting in their children's best interests, preparing them for successful lives in a harsh and unforgiving world. The psychological impact of these practices extended far beyond childhood itself. Adults who had survived these experiences often perpetuated them with their own children, creating generational cycles of trauma that lasted for millennia. The normalization of suffering, the acceptance of powerlessness, and the deep-seated belief that authority should never be questioned became fundamental aspects of Chinese culture that persisted long after the specific practices had been abandoned. Perhaps most sobering is the recognition that many of these attitudes and practices didn't disappear overnight. The transition from traditional Chinese child rearing to modern approaches was gradual and incomplete, with some elements persisting well into the 20th century and beyond. The belief that children should sacrifice their individual desires for family honor, that physical punishment is necessary for proper character development, and that academic achievement is more important than emotional well-being. These ideas continue to influence parenting practices today. But there's also something hopeful in understanding this history. By recognizing how dramatically our approaches to childhood have changed, we can appreciate the progress that's been made and remain vigilant about protecting children's rights and well-being. The fact that practices that were once considered normal and necessary now horrify us represents genuine moral and social progress. The children of ancient China deserve to be remembered not just as statistics or examples of historical practices, but as individuals who suffered, endured, and somehow found ways to survive in circumstances that tested the limits of human resilience. Their experiences remind us that childhood is not a natural state of protection and nurturing, but a culturally constructed ideal that requires constant effort and vigilance to maintain. Modern childhood, with all its imperfections and ongoing challenges, represents a remarkable achievement in human moral development. The idea that children have inherent rights, that their emotional well-being matters, that they deserve protection from adult economic and political conflicts, these concepts would have been incomprehensible to most people throughout most of human history. As we drift off to sleep tonight, perhaps we can take a moment to appreciate the radical transformation in how human societies treat their most vulnerable members. And maybe, just maybe, we can commit to continuing that progress, ensuring that future generations will look back at our current practices with the same mixture of horror and gratitude that we feel when examining the past. The children of ancient China couldn't choose their circumstances, but we can choose ours. We can choose to prioritize children's well-being over adult convenience, to value their emotional health over their economic productivity, and to see them as individuals deserving of respect rather than property to be managed. Sweet dreams, everyone, and remember to appreciate the simple fact that you live in a time when childhood is meant to be a time of safety, discovery, and joy, rather than a training ground for submission and suffering. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.